If you run a small recruitment agency, you don't have time to manually sift hundreds of CVs. Smart Sifty does it for you. It screens, shortlists, and ranks candidates instantly, fairly, and consistently, so you can focus on actually placing people, not drowning in admin. Less bias, less time wasted, more placements. If you're serious about running a smarter, more efficient agency, go to smartsifty.com and book a demo today.
What great ideas are so close within your grasp? Seeing other points of view, anticipating change, considering multiple possible turnouts, acknowledging uncertainty, searching for compromise. We're going to talk about how to get over those limiters of innovation so that you can extract better thinking from yourself and your team. So let's talk about how to win the future.
In this episode, I'm joined by Matt Fox, founder of Exitus Advisory, and someone who has spent over 25 years in the recruitment industry, building, scaling, and ultimately selling his own agency. We get into the reality that most founders don't like to talk about. The majority of recruitment agencies that want to sell never actually do. So what separates the few that achieve a successful exit from those that don't? Matt shares what buyers are really looking for, the biggest mistakes agency owners are making when they think about selling, their brand positioning, and how candidate experience can affect the value of your recruitment business. If you run a recruitment agency and think you might sell one day, even if that's years away, this conversation will probably change how you think about building your business. Welcome back, everybody, to the Marketing Rules podcast, and it's my pleasure to welcome on board today Matt Fox. Matt, it's good to have you here. We've been going a little bit backwards and forwards about this, but I've been kind of wanted you on for a while. We've not really had someone who does what you do on the podcast. It's kind of a pretty broad spectrum of things that we're going to kind of dip in today. However, for anyone who's kind of doesn't know you, or maybe knows your name but doesn't know exactly what kind of your business does, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your kind of background and what you do now.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks very much for having me on, first of all. It's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. So I run Exitus Advisory, which is kind of the product of, I suppose, sort of 26 years in the industry, really. I've been in the industry for a long time, launched, scaled, grew, developed, sold, exited my agency about 18 months ago. And and ever since then, now I work with a whole bunch of other owners and leaders on an advisory basis, and that will be around growth, developing their recruitment companies towards whatever goals they might have, whether that's an ultimate sale and an exit, or whether it's personal income, or the aim to be able to sort of step back and take an income from the business, whatever they want, because everyone's different, aren't they? And that combines quite nicely with the brokerage side of the business. So for people who are ready to sell and exit, and we probably would have worked with them for a while to get them to that point, we also then take their businesses to the market and make introductions and get them sold.
It's interesting kind of space, right? It feels like a lot of recruitment kind of owners, when they first start up, the plan is always to kind of exit at some point. I think it feels like, I don't know if that, I don't actually know what the stats are around how many recruitment agencies actually get sold, but it feels like a lot of the businesses that I've spoken to, especially when they're a startup, and it might be that's always the goal, right? And obviously that's not what happens, right? That just isn't the reality of kind of our space. So, from your experience and from what you do now, what are the chances, right? What do you need to put in place to make those chances higher, right? To make an exit on your recruitment agency.
Well, do you know what? I think you say a lot of people when they launch a recruitment business, they kind of sort of think they will sell it at some point or they will exit. I don't know that is the case, actually. I think a lot of people who launch recruitment businesses and run them generally are, on the whole, of course, because you do get, the serial entrepreneurs and the sort of the bigger, more corporate groups that are launching into a new market space. But on the whole, recruitment business owners are people who were really good recruiters and thought, I can do this better, stroke bigger, stroke different myself, and have then gone off and headed out on their own. And actually, very often, they haven't always given much thought to what comes in 3 years, 5 years, 7, 9, however long. So actually, the idea of selling that recruitment business is often something that occurs to them kind of sort of midway through the journey. So I don't buy into all of this. You read a lot of business advice websites. Oh, you should think about your exit on day one, on the day you launch. Well, that's not realistic. People don't do that. They're more worried about, finding some low hanging fruit and getting some deals on the board and still being here in 6 months' time, generally, if they're self-funded. But in answer to your question, I think, look, the percentage of businesses that actually sell, well, there's differing stats and figures on this depending on wherever you look. And I think the truth is nobody really knows, do they? But the generally accepted consensus is that it's a very small percentage of business owners who want to sell who are actually successful in doing so. I've read 3%, 8%, 6%, certainly less than 10%. And in terms of what are the reasons for that? Oh God, how long have you got? The main one is because selling any business, and my recruitment business, for most people is a once in a lifetime thing. So it's one thing that actually, by virtue, not many of us are actually experienced at. So we kind of sort of get to this point. You don't really know that you need advice because you don't know what you don't know. And you get to this point with something that you think, well, I'll just sell it. But actually, recruitment business owners generally are really bloody good at recruiting. They haven't necessarily thought about, well, hang on, what makes my business stand out? Why would somebody want to buy my business? Because to me, I've spent, 10, 15, 20 years growing this. So I think it's great. So everybody else will probably think it's great,
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's a kind of a false sense of security, I guess, with, that with businesses that aren't kind of experienced with that, or business owners that aren't experienced with that, how, I guess there's also a tendency to overvalue the business. I guess that's one of the things that kind of comes across. And so there's a bit of a dose of realism that has to kind of come up as part of that, those discussions that you have with your businesses and clients.
Yeah, very often, because again, something's a lot more, it's about perceived value, isn't it? Something's a lot more valuable to you than it might be because you understand it and you know it inside out, and you know that member of your team who bills loads of money is not going anywhere because she's really sort of comfortable, she's done really well, and but to a buyer, I don't have that comfort, I don't have that assurance. You might well have had it on really good authority from 2 of your clients that they're about to give you an extra 20 contractor bookings, but I don't know that as a potential buyer. And so therefore, what you always find with buying and selling businesses in any sector, it's all about risk management, and it's about where the balance of acceptance of risk sits, because you as the seller want to take as much as lower amount of risk as possible. So too does the buyer. So very often it's about where that sort of that pendulum comes to a rest, if you know what I mean. Sure.
And is there a special sauce that can that can I know that you've kind of got like a model and a process and a methodology that you use, and let's assume that is the special sauce. Without giving away all of your kind of IP, what does that look like when it comes to kind of that brokerage and a brokerage model?
Well, I suppose in terms of the kind of the joined up process, as in working with somebody to get their business to a point that it is ready for sale for the maximum value that they can realistically achieve, of course, then I guess that process that I would go through with any business owner is systematically looking at every area of risk in that business as a potential buyer would be concerned. And the biggest I suppose, sort of tip is to look at your business through the eyes of somebody who was potentially buying it. And where would you think the risk could be? So, as you say, without going into too much detail, one of the main things that you can find this on Google actually is owner dependency. So, how reliant on you is that business? And you've got the litmus test of, well, actually, can you clear off on holiday for a month, 5 weeks? A lot of people who are running a recruitment business will think to themselves immediately at that, Jesus Christ, transfer would be a fine thing. But can you do that without your phone ringing 15 times a day? Actually, could you get to that point where actually what your involvement looks like is perhaps a twice weekly catch-up call with the team? And that's it.
Yeah.
Because if you could, arguably your business is not overly owner dependent. And that's a really key point, and that's something I talk to a lot of owners about. But there's 100 other things that we would look at, in terms of actually how could this be optimized? And very often in a business that where the owner wants to sell it, it's not necessarily about going in and identifying enormous craters in that business and its plan. It's often about tuning it, making adjustments, making every aspect a bit more efficient or a bit more buyer friendly, because that's where the ultimate improvement in valuation comes.
Yeah. And I guess it's those tiny little kind of marginal gains that over time, that where you're supporting these businesses then just kind of start to mitigate those little lumps of risk that are kind of floating around in the business, that eventually just kind of builds a business that is, from a buyer's perspective, looks very looks like a good acquisition basically at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that obviously we try and talk about, and we try and twist the podcast to discuss, is around kind of marketing and branding. And I guess there must be a place, and you must see this in when you're kind of either going through the brokerage process or you're having these discussions around kind of M&A, around the kind of the value of the brand of the business that's being kind of bought. Talk to me about that, right? How big a part of that is it when it kind of in those discussions? Does it, is it really important? Is it as important as I would like it? Hopefully, I would like it to be, or where does it sit in the kind of hierarchy?
Well, I think it is important. Absolutely. I mean, look, we have to we've got to live in the real world and accept the fact that actually the main contributory factor towards your valuation in your recruitment business is of course going to be its profitability. And so there's no substitute for that. Is the business profitable? Does it make a profit? Yes. Fantastic. That's the first and major box ticked. But marketing and brand, it is, of course, it's important. For starters, we're all human, and we like to look at something that actually is that seduces us, and we feel is in our industry is professional or edgy, or has got an air of difference about it, and that's supremely important from a marketing perspective, because of course that's how we position our business. From a buyer's perspective, again, depends on who the buyer is. Some may be looking to absorb that business into a bigger group, and therefore the brand potentially may not survive. But there are an awful lot of buyers out there who are on, shall we say, a buy and build model, where they will want to retain the brand of the company that they're buying, and actually where they might want to use that brand to platform further growth. And so in that situation, it's really important. So obviously, yes, I mean, it depends on the buyer, but ultimately it just adds to the appeal of that business, doesn't it?
Yeah. And
sorry,
I guess one of the things that that is maybe difficult for founders and owner founders to kind of to hand over is they've got a kind of relationship with the brand that they have built. And they may have built a culture around that brand, obviously, because brand is not just the logo; it's everything else, the kind of all the touch points with it. When it comes to that aspect, i.e., not just what it looks like, if it looks pretty, but the kind of company culture and the way it's been kind of crafted, maybe from the top down, right from the start. Is that important to an acquirer as well, or is it simply a situation that this business has a great name within its kind of ICPs, and that's what we're kind of like looking to preserve, or is it kind of company culture and things like that as well?
Well, look, you might correct me on this James, but to me, marketing and the impact of marketing is about how we communicate that business's values and everything that it stands for. So, to me, in the context of a recruitment business, marketing isn't only valuable when we're talking about that recruitment company's own brand. It's every aspect of that, but it's also about how that company articulates and represents the employer brands of its client companies as well. It's about how it articulates its values and its behaviours to the candidates that it works with and that it represents. So from a marketing perspective, there are 101 touch points here. Also, if we look at most recruitment businesses, marketing's crucial because of the fact we work in an industry, especially in the UK, that is massively concentrated. Sorry, I say concentrated. What I mean is there are millions of recruitment businesses practically fighting for the same business that you've got. And so actually, how we differentiate is really important, because the vast majority of recruitment companies out there still, when you look at their websites, they're clutching to phrases like, we take time to understand our clients and candidates. I mean, really? Good God, how outdated is that? Everyone takes time to understand their clients and candidates, yet a lot of companies are still clinging to this like it's a point of difference. And that whole, recruitment businesses, shouting about we're different. But then actually you look at their USPs or whatever marketing collateral they're releasing, and actually they're exactly the same as everybody else. So it's kind of, bullshit, really. In most SME recruitment businesses, the point of difference is not the product, is it? Because ultimately, however much we might like to think is not the case, we broadly do the same kind of thing. The product is we will take that vacancy from the client and we will fill it. Sure, the roadmap and the journey of how we get there is pretty different, but actually the point of difference is normally the people and the behaviours and the culture. And the way that we deliver that service. So if you're not marketing that effectively, and if you're not communicating that to your target market, then actually it's kind of a waste of time.
Thinking Circles is your fractional marketing department, purpose-built for the recruitment industry with deep sector experience. We consult with recruitment agencies, talent teams, and HR and RegTech companies to deliver strategic marketing leadership with tangible results. Our proven approach enables you to attract top talent, drive client growth, and build standout employer brands. As a flexible extension of your team, we offer the insight and support you need to make smarter marketing decisions without the cost or complexity of hiring in-house. That's obviously music to my ears, right? Because
I'm sure. Do you know anyone that can help?
But we can kind of joke about it, but there are businesses out there that don't give kind of marketing that kind of level of kind of authority and kind of ownership and credence within their business, right? There are businesses still kind of out there that might be wanting to go on this journey to kind of exit or to kind of work with you in that way, but still haven't kind of got on that marketing kind of bandwagon, as it were. I guess it's never too late, and I guess the question is in the end, where does that sit? If a business hasn't really kind of got on that boat, right, it's never really too late to kind of to put that in place, because of everything you've just said, that it actually does it can affect your kind of viability, as it were.
I think it absolutely can. It's appeal, isn't it? And it's how you position that business, and the same applies to everybody in terms of a client that might want to work with you, a candidate that potentially might want to register with you as an agency. Look, a consultant that might be looking for another job and has come across your business and thought, "Oh, I really like that brand. That looks like something that I want to find out more about." Nobody's going to want to come and work with you purely because you've got a really sexy website and some decent marketing collateral. But what it does is it builds that profile, and that's why ROI, I think, is often quite difficult to measure as far as marketing is concern. But no, it is never too late. But actually, what you often find is that marketing almost becomes a bit of a growing pain for SME recruitment businesses. So I think back to when I launched mine, and actually in the early stages, you're kind of doing bits of everything. You've got an IT network that you've held together with tights and sticky tape, and the same applies to HR. And you're trying to do as much of it as you can do. Marketing is very much in that camp, because you get to a point where you're kind of, too big not to have a marketing provision, but you're not quite big enough to be able to, have somebody internally purely dedicated to it. Because again, it's one of those things that if we give it to somebody who's an operations person and we say, well, can you do a bit of marketing and a bit of HR? It's almost like that. There's not really a sort of a joined up kind of strategy in a way. So it does become a bit of a growing pain for small recruitment businesses.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we completely see that with kind of some of the clients we work with, and they fall pretty much into that bucket. And I guess there is maybe like a marketing mentality that you probably come across this, right? The businesses that completely kind of buy into it and understand it, and maybe have had a good experience, had a good kind of marketeer working with them at some point, or an agency, or whoever it might well be, compared to those ones that kind of are maybe still quite kind of sales focused, or maybe kind of like to be more kind of transactional. And I don't want to kind of put a broad sweeping kind of brush across all kind of recruitment agencies that are like this, and I'm wondering if there is a lot of that mentality that you kind of come across. There's maybe a bit of a differentiation between the ones who kind of get it, had it work, and know the value of it, between those ones maybe who haven't necessarily had it work and are kind of a bit reticent to go down, because it's seen as sometimes as a cost as opposed to a kind of revenue generating.
It is, but I think you've got to really get behind a marketing strategy to see some value for it, because it's like anything in a recruitment business. I could introduce a new business development strategy today, and actually, if we want to see results from that by 4:00 on Tuesday, then actually, is that a really realistic expectation? Consistency is really important, and actually, from a marketing perspective, it's very often something that needs to be put in place and driven through for some time to start to see the return on that. But also it's profile building a lot of the time for that recruitment business. And what you can't often measure is that when your consultant then does pick up the phone as part of a sales strategy, or perhaps they're using any one of the sort of slightly more technically advanced strategies that are open to them these days. Perhaps they're using an automated outreach tool or whatever. What's very difficult to measure is actually the fact that at the other end, at the clients on the client side, very often they will receive that outreach, whatever it looks like, but the wheels will have been oiled because they've seen that brand, they've romanced with it on a few occasions before. There's been some outreach or some stuff that's been posted somewhere on LinkedIn that happens to have come up in their feed, and actually this looks a lot more comfortable and a lot more familiar to me, and I'm starting to feel a bit of a resonance with that brand, so therefore I'm going to entertain a conversation with that consultant. So for me, really the two work hand in hand. Not disputing the fact that, look, I've got clients that haven't spent a penny on marketing. And everything that they've done has been through, outbound, old school, speculative, working on a speculative basis with candidates, MPC, outreach, whatever you might call it. And that's worked really well for them. But you know what? Then we introduce a bit of a marketing strategy and a little bit of spend and the whole thing turbocharges.
Yeah.
So as I say, it's absolutely got to be a joined up approach.
Yeah, I've always ended up kind of calling it a slightly more kind of grown up approach to all of it, right? I think it's when you go from businesses goes from that kind of startup to scale up to kind of grow up, and I always kind of see it that's the point where businesses kind of, like you said, it can kind of really turn things around, because it's much more kind of adult conversation people are having, as opposed to, is it a cost, is it this, is it that? It's kind of like no, it can be all of those things and more, in all honesty. I want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned earlier, and and probably gets completely kind of bypassed in some of these kind of conversations, is all this from a candidate perspective. Okay, when someone's buying or acquiring another kind of recruitment agency, Obviously they're buying. They're obviously this agency that they're buying might have some great brands that they're working with, etc. Where does the candidate fit into those kind of considerations, or if they do?
Well, centrally, really. Again, in terms of, will a buyer value a business based on its candidate experience? Not necessarily, but this is something that obviously, again, increases the overall appeal. But where they will buy an agency, sometimes based on candidate experiences, where we're actually using that intelligently. So there are still quite a few recruitment businesses out there that would view candidate experience as, as secondary or not quite as important. And I don't think we're ever going to get away from that all the time. The client is the one that's ultimately holding the checkbook and paying the invoice, if you like. Is that right? Is that wrong? That's another conversation. But I think from a candidate experience perspective, you can monetize that. And it amazes me how many recruitment businesses don't do that. Look, in terms of how we monetize candidate experience, well, the principle is pretty straightforward. We give somebody a positive experience. They go off and tell other people, and hopefully feel comfortable in referring those candidates to us. Also, they tell your clients they're the best loudest source of marketing that you've got. But more than that, what I see in contractor-led businesses, the ones that are absolutely maximizing spend out of their existing clients are the ones that are really engaging with their candidates. They're holding, fortnightly feedback meetings or sessions with their candidates. They're quizzing them. They're asking them about, the projects they're working on, the teams they're working in. Where are the bottlenecks in that? What would make it easier for you in that business? They've then got valuable knowledge that they can go back to the client with that is, so much more important than just ring in to check in and see how everything is. Well, actually, I've got some real tangible feedback that, has come from the contractors that we've got with you guys. This will enable you to streamline X, Y, or Z, or to get the project delivered a bit quicker, or, and I figured you'd want to hear that. Well, now you're a partner as opposed to a service provider. You're on board with that business. You're picking up other inquiries. You're part of that conversation. That's how you monetize the candidate experience piece, because in amongst all of that, you've also got a candidate that's working via an agency that listens to them, that cares about them because they feel like they've got that communication piece on point. And then, of course, all the other stuff you do, like, maybe like the old school candidate awards or the newsletters, that's the sizzle on the sausage. It's about getting that. If you can get that bit right without spending time where it doesn't need to be spent, perhaps, over and above the absolute basics, like obviously pay people on time, don't cock up their compliance and, all this sort of stuff. But that's how you can really monetize that candidate experience, through greater client penetration and ensuring that you've got, almost all of the spend within that business.
And do, the businesses that you've worked with who've kind of gone through this kind of maybe an M&A, this is something that has been important to the acquirer and the buyer?
They'll always ask about it.
Right.
They very, very it's very unusual. Very rarely will a buyer not ask about, how do you work with your candidates? How do you find your candidates? What do you find successful? How do you manage your workforce? And this is almost like, it's the same as when you go to any client meeting, you want to talk about the things that you feel add value, that differentiate you as a business. And in this market, which is so ferociously competitive, it is quite difficult to find points of difference. And actually, if you can do things like that, then you're onto a winner, because straight away you're adding value.
Yeah. Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Obviously, we'll include all of your details in the show notes, but if anybody does want to reach out to you, where can they get hold of you?
Well, we're all in the recruitment industry, so LinkedIn is the is clearly the best way. I'm on there regularly. You'll find all my contact details on there, and of course, as you and I have discussed, Exitus kind of occupies a relatively unique point in the market, because my point of difference, if you like, is that actually we provide growth advice to anybody who wants to grow and scale, but we also are joined up with the brokerage side, so that obviously we can help people on the exit journey as well. So, but yeah, look, really enjoyable. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you again, Matt. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the Marketing Rules podcast on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcasting platforms. I've been your host, James Whitelock, and I hope you can join me and more amazing guests next time. The Marketing Rules podcast is a Think in Circles production.